I went out with a friend for lunch, so he was kind of left alone with the girls for a little bit that day. I just went shopping with my friend. I came back home and I bought him a ton of shirts, and I was showing him all the shirts I bought for him, and he seemed like he was having a good day, and he was excited for me to be back home and to hang out with him. And so I cooked dinner, and we ate, and we were just having our normal night routine. We put Colette to bed together, we read her a book, and then we went to our room, and we were just kind of talking, and I could tell that something was wrong. And he said he was sorry for everything he put me through. It was really hard on me when I was pregnant, and he was heavy in his addiction, and he just really wasn't himself during that time, and he was just apologizing to me for everything, and I could just tell he was putting a lot of blame on himself. And I talked to him, and I told him that I loved him, and that I forgave him, and things are different now, and we're on a new path. And I gave him a hug and a kiss and told him I love him, and that it's okay, and that no matter what he ever did, I would always love him and be here for him, and there's nothing that he could do to make me stop loving him. And after that, he seemed okay, and I thought I helped, and we just kind of continued on with our night. And he said he was gonna have a bath, which he does every night before bed, and he knew that I wouldn't question it, you know? So he leaves the room, and I'm just kind of sitting there waiting for him to get out. About 30 minutes later, I kind of hear Colette start to wake up and toss around. So I go to her room, and I check on her, and I open the door, and I tell her, you know, go back to bed, and then I'm like, Landon's been in the bath for a while, I'm gonna check on him. And I go to the bathroom, and the bath is empty. It didn't look like he had a bath whatsoever. And so I checked all the rooms, because he wasn't in the bathroom. I checked Colette's room again, because maybe, you know, he was in there with her snuggling, because he does that. He'll go in her room and just snuggle with her sometimes. And I thought maybe I just missed it and I didn't see him in there, but I checked and he wasn't there. And our house is pretty small, you know, I checked everywhere he could be. And then I went into the garage, and when I opened the garage, I saw him, he had hung himself, and he didn't look alive. He was very pale, and I was in so much shock, and it took me a second to realize that it was actually happening. And I ran to the kitchen, and I grabbed a knife, and I came back, and I cut him down, and I called 911, and I told them where I was and what happened, and I laid him down, and I checked if he had a pulse, and he didn't, and there was just nothing there at all. He was not there. He was dead. I knew at that moment that he was gone. There's no words to describe how I felt at that time. Very few people will ever understand, and if you do understand what that is like, I'm sorry to you, because no one should have to experience that. And then the ambulance got there, and a police officer escorted me out of the garage and told me that I shouldn't be in there. And then Colette was up again, and she was banging on her door and screaming, and Delilah started crying. I was shaking, and there was nothing I could do. I felt so helpless, and I started making calls because I knew all of our family was far, and they just need to get there as soon as possible. So I called my parents, I called his parents. It didn't feel real until I called his mom, and I heard the terror in her voice as I told her what happened. And she asked me if he's dead, and I said, I don't know. They're working on him, but I don't know. And she was screaming and crying. And then an EMT comes in and tells me that he has a pulse. They got a pulse back, and they were taking him to the hospital. And then I called a friend to come over and watch the kids so I can go to the hospital. It felt like it took hours for them to come. In reality, it probably wasn't that long, but I sat there waiting for them so I can go and be with him. And they finally got there, and I got a ride to the hospital. My friend drove me to the hospital, and he was saying, you know, there's lots of programs for him for when he wakes up, and, you know, we're gonna be with you through all this, and he'll be okay. And he kept talking about, you know, when he wakes up. And I'm just like, he's dead. Like, I saw him, like, he's not waking up. I got to the hospital, and they wouldn't let me see him at first. And his doctor came in and explained, very particular with the words he chose to use, not to give me false hope, but not to tell me that he was gone yet. And they had an investigator talk to me, and just, they were questioning me about how it all went down. And then I saw him, to see him with a tube down his throat, and all these wires and IVs. It's not the way you want to see someone you love, but at least he looked more alive. And he looked like my Landon, and he was warm. He wasn't just cold and pale. And I just held his hand. And then they took him up to his hospital room in the ICU, and I was just numb. They had me in the waiting room while they got him set up in there, and I was just sitting there just staring at the floor, and I was just in such disbelief. And then my brain started going to places like, if I would have got up and checked on him a little bit sooner, maybe he'd be okay, and just all the what ifs of how it could have gone differently. And I told myself, everyone's gonna be so mad at me, because I felt like it was my fault, and I was so sure that his parents were gonna come in and yell at me and be mad at me for not checking on him sooner. And I just put so much blame on myself, just thinking about all the ways that the day could have gone differently. And maybe if I didn't go out with my friend that day, or maybe if I had talked to him a little bit longer when he was telling me how sorry he was for everything. And then his parents got there, and I was so nervous. And they just came up and gave me a hug and said, it's gonna be okay. And his mom went back to see him in his hospital room, and she wasn't there for very long. She came back and she said she just couldn't do it. It was really hard to see. And then his dad got there. I've never seen his dad cry. And just seeing him break down was so hard. And all these emotions just kept coming in waves from being in a state of shock and just staring off and disassociating myself from reality and snapping back and realizing the situation and that it's real and that this isn't a dream and just seeing everyone crying. I went back in the room with him and I was holding his hand and he would squeeze it. And then his eyes would flutter open just for a second and it gave me a lot of hope because, you know, he's moving. He's opening his eyes. And I was talking to him and I was saying, Landon, open your eyes. Like, I'm right here. It's me. It's Camryn. Squeeze my hand. And at that point I thought for a second maybe he's not gone and maybe he's gonna wake up. And then the doctor sits us down and says that they did an MRI and his brain didn't look severely damaged, but they said that it was likely just because they did it so early, right after it happened, that his brain is still in the process of shutting down, and the fact that he was moving just meant that his neurons were all just kind of firing off at once before they just completely died out. So it wasn't really him there, it was just his body having a reaction. Doctors have a certain way, though, of wording things where they won't really give you an answer. So he told us all that, but at the same time, he kind of worded it in a way that it's very much, you know, a possibility, and they're unsure, and they're gonna have to wait and see. But at that point, I think we all kind of knew. And I just remember feeling that hope when I thought for a second that he might be okay. I wish I could go back to when I felt hope. I wish I could go back to just an hour earlier before he told us that I thought it was a good sign and I thought it meant he was waking up. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. And to at least feel a little bit of hope is all I needed at that time. And then I just had none. And everyone around me and my family and his family, they were all kind of like, you know, let's pray, like, let's have hope. There's hope. And I just knew that there wasn't any hope of him waking up. I found him and he was dead. And you don't really come back from that. After your brain goes so long without oxygen, I knew that he was gone. And it was really hard hearing everyone say, you know, I'm praying and he's gonna wake up, like, you know, have faith, he's gonna wake up. Because the last thing I wanted was to get my hopes up again, just to be crushed. So from then on out, I just kind of started accepting it. I started mourning him and, you know, having those thoughts like he was actually gone. Just really trying to wrap my head around all of it. You know, one second he's there, the next he's in a hospital bed. I had to leave the hospital eventually, and take a shower, and check on the girls, and just do something other than sitting in the waiting room crying. But I couldn't go back to the house, it was so hard. And I had to go back to pack a bag, and every single thing I owned, everything we owned, it just had a memory attached to it, and it just all reminded me of him. And, you know, I remember when we bought that together, and he loved that shirt, and it's just so hard going in there. And then the thought of even walking by the garage door. But I got me stuff, and I went to a hotel, and I stayed there for that week. And then on August 18th, after just kind of waiting around for days to hear a final answer, we got it. There's only one person allowed in the hospital room at a time, and I just happened to be the one in there with him when the doctor came in. And he sat me down, he said they ran all the tests, and they tested his brain function and his brain waves and his MRI again, and at 2:22 they pronounced him brain dead. And my heart just sank, and I knew pretty much that whole week that was going to happen at some point, but to actually hear it and know it, it was really hard. And so I called his parents up and his brother, and they came up, and I told them that he was gone, and we all just cried over him and prayed and talked to him, even though he wasn't really there. And then after we all kind of had a second with him, we walk outside and someone stops me and says, we need to talk with you, come to this room. And they set us up in a conference room, and they said Landon was registered to donate his organs, and they read me off the list of all the organs that he chose to donate, and he donated everything. He wanted to save as many people as possible, and I wasn't surprised to hear that he was an organ donor. He is just such a compassionate, loving, caring person, and he always put others above himself. So even in death, he was caring about other people. And so they explained that they would spend the next 24 hours trying to gather information on all of his organs and finding recipients, and that the next day he would have a surgery where they would cut off his life support and then harvest his organs. So his family said goodbye to him that day. They had to head back to Dallas to start making funeral arrangements. So they said their goodbyes and they left. And then the next morning before his surgery, I went up there and I said my final goodbyes to him. And it was so hard because, like I said, like, he was warm and his chest was moving and he was breathing. And even though it was on a machine, he was breathing and he looked alive, even though he wasn't. And it was really hard to see him with all the tubes and everything. So I just held him and I closed my eyes so I wouldn't have to see him like that. And I just thought about him as the happy Landon that I know, with this smile and those dimples. And I just hugged him and I just told him how much I loved him. And then I'd stop hugging him, and then I'd hug him again because I knew eventually it would have to be the last one. I had to say goodbye at some point. I couldn't just hug him forever. And so I would just hug him, and then I'd be like, okay, it's time to go. This is it. But then I couldn't, and I turned around and I hugged him again and again. And then eventually it was the last one, and I left. And that's the last time I saw him. And as much as I knew he wasn't really there, his body was there. And that was the smile I fell in love with, and the hands I held, and the hair that I would run my fingers through, and the forehead that I would kiss, and the eyes that I would stare into. And that's the man I fell in love with. And the last time I would see him. And all throughout his stay at the hospital, there was little signs of him, and little things that just reminded me that he was there, even though he wasn't. I think his spirit was still there. We got married on the 22nd of June, and he was in room 22, and they announced him brain dead at 2:22, so that number just kind of kept popping up, and I didn't really know what to make of it, but it just felt like a sign. But I walked away from room 22. It was the hardest goodbye I've ever had to say. When something like this happens, there's a lot of questions that will never be answered. Everyone asks why. I looked for a note. There was no note, no explanation, but I know him very well, and so after having a lot of time to think about it and process it, I've been able to kind of piece it together in my head, and I'll never truly know the answer. But I know Landon, and I know he was not thinking rationally. He's a very impulsive person, he always has been, and he does things without thinking. And I think he felt guilty about how everything has gone for the past year, and I think he just felt like a burden, and like we'd be better off without him, which is so far from the truth. And I wish he would have known that. I'm heartbroken. Glenn is confused. There's no way that we're better